You know, it wasn't all that long ago, maybe century and a half ago, that subject like evolution, development, even progress itself, was pretty well limited to scholarly circles. And it was only in the middle of the 19th century that very slowly, and as a result of the work of people like Darwin and so on, that it entered the popular discourse. And it's come to the point now, of course, that it's second nature for us. In fact, you assume everything is evolutionary. We understand that life on Earth has evolved. We understand that we ourselves had a different shape at one time in distant history. Society evolves, civilization evolves, cultures evolve, even science and technology, people talk about them evolving. And then almost everybody looks at it that way. Obviously, there are some segments of mankind that are uncomfortable about evolution, but they are the very rare exception. There's only one area of human consciousness in which this is not true, which people do not think of in evolutionary terms. And very strange, that crucial area of human consciousness is humanity's relationship to God. We do not think of that in evolutionary terms at all, quite the opposite. If you attempted to do so, you'd run into very quickly a great deal of opposition. The great religions of the world, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, whatever, are discrete, distinct religions. And far from seeing themselves as evolving phenomena, their concern has always been to keep in close touch with the roots of the religion. And in fact, when people are out of touch with the roots of the religion, scholarship has devoted itself to recovering the roots of religion, the original Christ, and so on. And of course, the idea that all of them would be seen as one evolutionary process would be anathema, I think, safe to say, to the followers of most of the great religions. Well, Baha'u'llah has completely recast the whole nature of religion. Probably would be more accurate to say that the Bab originally recast the whole nature of religion as one evolutionary process, as one system of knowledge that stretches back and beyond the reaches of recorded time and will go on that way. It's a system of knowledge that has taught humanity values and has done so progressively. It's not merely one after the other, but a developing, an unfolding process. And we as Baha'is are now quite comfortable. You might say we live comfortably in history. In fact, we can't think of religion, probably it's safe to say, in any other terms than evolutionary terms. Religion is progress by its very nature. And that's not only progress through the revelation of these various prophetic religions, but within the Baha'i faith itself. From the Bab to Baha'u'llah, to the ministry of Abdu'l-Baha, to the emergence of the administrative order with the guardianship, and after that the Universal House of Justice. I remember when I was first investigating the Baha'i faith, many more years ago than I care to think about, I couldn't understand why they had to have two manifestations of God. I mean, one was enough for the Buddhists, for the Christians, for the Muslims. Even for the Jews, they had at least one at a time with great stretches of centuries in between. Why did the Baha'is have to have two manifestations of God? Well, of course, I was missing the point. And the point is evolution. The point is progress. There is a development. The Bab had certain things to achieve during his very, very short mission. And we'll talk about that at a later stage in this series of discussions. And Baha'u'llah still others, and so on. And that's how we have been taught to look at religion, and we're at home in it. What we have to be very careful about is that we don't begin to think that this process somehow ended, say, with the ministry of Abdu'l Baha or the ministry of Shoghi Effendi, the guardian of the faith. Evolution is an ongoing process. Evolution is reality. Evolution in all is the fundamental feature of all aspects of life, and most particularly of religion, of the gradual development of values that drive the advancement of civilization. And in discussing this evolutionary process, we have to start with the point that Baha'u'llah makes very strongly, that we are living in the coming of age of humankind. All of the other revelations of God, the prophetic revelations, were preparing mankind for this day. Obviously, they taught, they cultivated certain qualities, capacities in the individual soul, but they also promised that the day would come when the whole of society would be transformed, when the kingdom of God would come on earth, when the will of God would be done on earth as it was done in heaven, and so on. Both the personal and the social. Well, the Baha'i Faith is not prophetic. The Baha'i Faith is this day. We are living in the day of the coming of age of the human race, the collective coming of age of the human race, in which we can see ourselves as one single people occupying one single homeland, which is the earth. You could say really that human history is starting today with us, because the histories of the past were the history of different peoples or races or dynasties or whatever. And since this is the case, and since we are involved, we are engaged in the construction of at least the foundations of the kingdom of God on earth, the foundations of a global society, the foundations of a really functioning united human race, and the development of what you could call universal civilization, since that's what life is about for us. We have to be aware that the building process itself is obviously progress. It's obviously development or evolution, if you want to call it that. You move from one stage to another, from the foundations to the next stage, and so on, ultimately to the roof. So we are living in an evolutionary process in our religious life, just as is happening to mankind generally in physical life and material life of the planet. And in doing so, there's a huge challenge. And the challenge is, obviously, the cause is going to keep on evolving. Because of the covenant of Baha'u'llah, it's not going to be suddenly arrested, it's not going to be sidetracked, nothing like that is going to happen. It's going to keep on evolving, maybe even at an accelerating pace during crucial periods. The issue is, will we keep on evolving? Will I keep on evolving as an individual? Will I keep up? I don't want to wake up and suddenly discover that I'm standing by the side of the road reflecting while the Baha'i cause is miles down ahead of me someplace and accelerating. If that were to happen, I would have become a bystander. I would have become somebody who's no longer engaged in a building process that is the whole purpose of human life today, especially the purpose of life for a Baha'i. So what we want to do in this series of discussions is to take a look at some historical circumstances, both outside the faith and within that is outside the Baha'i faith and within the Baha'i faith, that draw the implications of what I've been talking about for us, that make it easier for us to understand. Because after all, Baha'u'llah says God's greatest gift to man It's not love. It's not mercy. It's not any number of other things you might be able to think of. The greatest gift of God to mankind is reason. We are not just souls, we are rational souls. Faith, Baha'u'llah says, for a Baha'i, is not sort of merely blind belief, though it can be blind in circumstances that require it. Faith is conscious knowledge. Faith is conscious knowledge that leads to action. And that being the case, we want to understand what we're doing, and we want to understand why we're doing it, at least to the best of our ability. We serve the cause because we love Baha'u'llah. We serve the cause in a particular way because we believe absolutely in the guidance of the Universal House of Justice. But to the extent we can, we have to try to understand why, because understanding empowers us. And as I say, though, the thing we do not want as individuals is to find ourselves left behind. This is, I can't imagine a tragedy greater for an individual who has recognized Baha'u'llah. It would be a good idea if we stopped now and took a look at a practical historical example of not only of the nature of the phenomenon, but of its seriousness as well. And that example is the problem that the Western world has always had with Islam. Basically, what the Christian Europe did hundreds of years ago, after it felt that it had won the contest with Islam, was that it sort of swept it under the carpet. Islam no longer was an issue at all for the Christian world, for the European world. And then, of course, once we get into the 19th and 20th centuries with Western economic power, the technological developments and scientific developments of the West and so on, that consolidated it. Islam simply didn't count any longer. At least that was the theory. And now all of a sudden, Islam has come roaring out from underneath the carpet, and it has become the number one preoccupation of political life in our period of history in the beginning of the 21st century, because it's the religion that at one time was so beneficial to mankind has now been hijacked, in large measure at least, by some of the worst people probably on the face of the planet. And the result is that it permeates and all aspects of our life, both larger on the larger political level, even on the simple level of human life of people who want to travel from one country to another by plane and so on. How did this come about, and why did it happen? More important, even than that, of course, are the implications. If you look back to what historians call, quite rightly, in European development, the Dark Ages, Europe lived for centuries in what? In darkness, in filth, in squalor, in ignorance, in superstition, in violence, in disorder. And this was the result, we're told, of the collapse of Roman civilization and so on. Fine. But right across the Mediterranean, right across the river, you could almost say, was this brilliant civilization, one of the most brilliant civilizations the world has ever seen. In fact, I suppose it's safe to say that we have never had a civilization in the whole history of human life on this planet that burst with such brilliance in so short a time and permeated all aspects of human life. There's nothing that Islamic civilization didn't seem to be able to accomplish. Take a look at mathematics, every branch of mathematics, trigonometry, geometry, algebra, the invention of the zero, the whole decimal system. It revolutionized mathematical conceptions. The same thing in sciences, physics, chemistry, optics, you name it, medicine. And along with huge advances in medicine, hospitals, actual public hospitals in the cities of the Islamic world. You had these great cities which had street lights, running water, they had museums, they had hospitals, they had universities. And the same thing was true of the other arts, music, even practical, simple things like being able to mail a letter in Lebanon and having it delivered in Morocco, writing a draft, a bank draft in Spain and having it cashed in Persia on the other side of the world, and the whole civilization functioning as unlike Roman civilization, with one common language and with one common moral code. I mean, it is breathtaking. And a civilization that was deeply moral. A civilization in which a man could be not only a warrior, but he could also be a spiritual mystic. He might be a poet. He might be an administrator. But because there was no difference, he was only one human being, he had all these different faculties. It was not a world of endless divisions, this being separated from that, and so on. Now, obviously, you can't have that happening on one side of the river, so to speak, and darkness on the other side, and so inevitably, the Europeans began to borrow, and especially as the Muslims began to invade Europe, first of all in Sicily, southern Spain, southern Italy, and on a very grand scale, of course, in Spain. And the Europeans benefited from this. The first university in Europe was Toledo in Spain, a Muslim university, but Christians came from France and Germany and studied it. And then, of course, that produced Oxford in due course, and the Sorbonne and Montpellier and Bologna and Western universities as well, but very limited, very, very limited in the studies that they were willing to contemplate. And the limit, of course, ironically enough, was the source of all these wonders. The one thing that could not be studied, that could not be taken seriously, was the Quran, which had produced this Islamic civilization, because Islam was the work of the devil as far as the church was concerned, and so on. This went on not for 1 or 2 or 3 generations, we're talking about 500 years. It boggles the mind. It boggles the mind how people living so close to such a cornucopia of wonders would not automatically go to the source, no matter what the church said, but nevertheless, that's what actually happened. Now, as Baha'is, we have a number of benefits, but one of them certainly is the extraordinary frankness of the Guardian on certain subjects. He says quite frankly that the Renaissance, the European Renaissance, was not a Christian phenomenon, but an Islamic phenomenon. He credits Islam with the Renaissance, and I think we're in a period of history now where Western historians are beginning to nibble at the edges of this, very nervously at the edges of this subject, but sooner or later, I think this is going to be recognized. But that doesn't change the fact, of course, that basically Europe missed the bus. A whole people, or peoples, a whole continent of people literally missed the bus, because it wasn't only the pointed arch, for example, however valuable that was to Gothic architecture, that was there to be borrowed, if you like. It was the moral and spiritual insights of the Quran that the West denied itself. What do I mean by that? Christianity, of course, is very much a religion that emphasizes peace, and that's wonderful. The reality, of course, is that human nature is not peaceful. Human beings are not peaceful until they get educated. Ultimately, I suppose that will happen in the future of our own time. But the Quran deals with it. The Quran is a revelation of God that is highly realistic in terms of human nature. And so the Quran explains that in warfare, because it assumes that warfare will be a human activity for a long, long time to come, that warfare should be disciplined in this fashion and so on. Diplomacy should be of this nature. The relationship between reason and faith is not only encouraged, it's logical to, if you read the Quran, this is logical. Muslim theologians struggled with it a long time, but Islamic civilization demonstrated the fact that as the human being is one, so are the activities that are the positive activities that humanity is capable of developing. Well, the fact that that the West denied itself this kind of discipline, the consequences have been appalling. You can imagine, it's no use saying, well, we don't want to have, the West benefited from not having a religion that has produced the such things as the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and so on today. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda are features of the degeneration of Islam, not of its vitality. There are all kinds of features of the degeneration of Christianity that I don't need to go into, but that I would certainly hold their own with the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda, starting with the Inquisition and going downstairs from there on. The West has suffered. The West has demonstrated its capacity with Judaism, with the Bible, and with the Gospel to explore possibilities in these areas of divine guidance in a way that has illuminated the whole of civilization. You can imagine what would have happened if at the universities in Europe the Quran had been studied with the whole range of its moral teachings, studied by a people who were on the verge of exploring and conquering North America. Well, we didn't do that. Why revisit all this past history after all it's 1,400 years ago? Well, we revisit it because we're still paying the price. It's useless for Christians, for example, to say, well, what kind of a scripture deals with warfare? We're not supposed to have warfare. Well, the answer is, then why have you Christians had so much of it? Because after all, Christians have killed millions more people than the rest of humanity put together. So, indeed, we're not supposed to have warfare. God intends to gradually train us out of it. And the Quran is one stage that would have been hugely beneficial. And so I think from a present-day Baha'i point of view, the reason, my view, I don't know, of course, but I suspect that the reason why the Guardian emphasized so strongly studying Islam, and studying it, he says, from the sources, not from Western commentaries on it, studying the original Islamic sources, being unafraid, examining the whole thing, is because we would have filled in this huge gap in the evolution of Western civilization. And in doing so, we would have prepared ourselves far more effectively to understand the purpose of Baha'u'llah in bringing about a global civilization. Now, ironically, the delicate maiden who was supposed to be protected by this refusal to look at the Quran, to take Islam seriously, was, of course, the Christian faith. All of this rejection of Islam as the work of Satan or something was to make certain that Christianity remained protected and pure and so on in Europe. But in borrowing all of these advantages of Islamic civilization, beginning with the Renaissance and leading on into the Enlightenment in due course, Europe built a new civilization in which Christianity had no place. It built a civilization in which there was a growing and growing and growing gap between faith, between the insights of religion on the one hand, and the real world that people had to live in their day-to-day life, and that they wanted to live in because they were deriving all kinds of benefits from it. So I think it's helpful from a Baha'i point of view if you're going to look at the evolution of religion, as Baha'u'llah and the Bab teach it, if we understand that this is a very serious business. The very idea that a whole continent of people could have missed the boat, the whole continent of people could have paid the appalling price that Europe has paid for rejecting the revelation of God for the time that revelation. To look at that, one realizes how serious it is that we as individuals today keep up, that we understand, that we follow, we are eager to see the next stage in the evolution of the cause of God, in this case, the revelation of Baha'u'llah for our time. It's not that the cause is going to run off the road and so on. We are living in the age of the coming age of humankind. So we are collectively, the human race, guided by Baha'u'llah, is in the process of building what has traditionally been called the kingdom of God on earth, global society and a universal civilization and so on. And that's going to be a stage by stage by stage process. Obviously, since we've been given a huge privilege of participating in that, of contributing to that, it's vital to us that we know where we are at any given time, and that we not allow ourselves to, through inattention or distraction or whatever you want to call it, to miss the bus, so that we're standing here by the side of the road all by ourselves reflecting on things, and the cause of God is miles down the highway and probably accelerating. We're going to take a look in this series of talks at some of the implications of the different stages, some of them that we have already gone through, the stage that we're at right now, and the obvious implications of the immediate future. Last day we were talking about Islam from various angles, particularly the immense leap forward, both spiritually and culturally, that resulted from the revelation of the Quran, the way in which mind and heart came together in a whole civilization, the extraordinary advance that the Quran's teachings, and particularly Muhammad's own example gave with respect to racial tolerance. The Quran, you could say, was standing at the threshold of modernity, and particularly this was the most important, I suppose, of all of the teachings that the Quran gives us, is an acceptance of all of the great religions, an acceptance of the work of all of the prophets of God. And I wanted to read a specific statement that reflects this, or one of the many statements. The Quran says, "We believe in God and the revelation given unto us, and to Abraham, Ismail, Isaac, and Jacob, and that given to Moses, and to Jesus, and that given to all of the prophets from their Lord." So this is a very different approach to religion than humanity had been familiar with. And of course, the response to it of minds like Rumi and Ibn Khaldun and Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and all these great thinkers, they were simply liberated by this whole new conception of reality and its welcome of the use of the mind. For instance, one of the hadiths, I think it is, says, search for knowledge even unto China. It was this liberality that was so characteristic of Islam. Now, theoretically, a great breakthrough should have taken place in terms of a recognition of process, recognition of some kind of evolutionary process. It didn't happen. And the question is, why didn't it? The reason it didn't, of course, was because of the growth of Islamic theology, a theological system that began to grow on the surface of what you could call Islamic thought, or the thought throughout Islamic civilization. Because in Islamic theology, there is, of course, only one religion, but that religion was given whole and perfectly at the beginning by God. It was given to the Jews, and essentially Islamic theology says that the Jews failed to respond properly, and they even went to the extent of corrupting their own scriptures, so they didn't have to respond to God. This is the theory. So God took it from them, and he gave it to the second group of people, to the Christians. And the Christians did exactly what the Jews had done. They too corrupted the scriptures so that they didn't have to really be faithful to the revelation of God. It was taken away from them, and it was given to the Arab people. And according to Islamic theology, the Arabs at last, God had found a people who were able to accept the revelation as God intended it and to follow it. Well, it was simply one faith repeated over and over and over again instead of an opening to the idea of process. So one has to ask oneself, what happened? Why is a failure from a civilization that was so liberal, so creative, that had embraced such a wide diversity of cultural and religious and aesthetic impulses? Well, what happened was what had always happened. The most severe warning that the Quran gives, and it appears several places throughout the Quran, is against what the Quran calls joining partners with God. Let me read you two. A passage that, there are many passages, but this one, the Quran says, say, the things that my Lord hath indeed forbidden are shameful deeds, whether open or secret, sins and trespasses against truth or reason, the assigning of partners to God, for which he hath given no authority, and saying things about God of which ye have no knowledge. Well, this is a perfect description of theology, in a nutshell. And what the Islamic clergy did as they gradually, very slowly began to impose their control on Islamic civilization was to create, for example, the Sharia. They drew from the Quran, allegedly, so they claimed, all of the basic laws that should govern human behavior, but they then codified these laws in a system which ultimately became, tragically, a wall between the believer. Instead of being a doorway for the believer into the mind and will of God, it became a wall between the believer and the Quran. And of course, this is the old story of theology's work throughout the history of other religions as well. But the result in this case, of course, was that the West, which which by this time was beginning to lose where Christianity, the Judeo-Christian religious system, was beginning to lose its grip, the West was able to take from, and I think we talked about this the other day, was able to take from Islam those superficial features that were beneficial to civilization without paying any attention to the Quran itself. But the consequence was that it simply overwhelmed Islam. And throughout all of these tentative approaches of Islamic civilization through Spain, through Sicily, through Italy, up through the Balkans to the very gates of Vienna, this was arrested, and then the Great Retreat began until today. Islam is simply, the Islamic societies of the world today are history's great failures. They are systems which are failing completely to respond to the challenge of modernity. And this was a society in the 19th century that the Bab addressed. You could say, I think, almost as an act of divine mercy, he clothed his message in the familiar terms of Islamic theology, because these were the people he was speaking to. For a Westerner reading the Bab's writings, it's very, very difficult to contrast the Bab's writings with those of Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah, you understand exactly what he's saying, because the principles are not clothed in Islamic concepts from a previous age. But for the bright young students in the seminaries throughout Iran, this was truly a revelation in their experience of it, as well as in its actual origins. One would tend today, I think, to think of seminarians as not exactly on the cutting edge of scholarship. But in Iran, that's what was possible. Theology was the very cutting edge of scholarship for Iran. And these young people responded, these young men particularly in these seminaries responded with tremendous enthusiasm to the Bab's teachings. Because, of course, there was nothing in their experience that came close to it. He opened the concept, for example, of progressive revelation itself. Suddenly they saw all of the revelations not merely as the same religion repeated over and over again, but as a steadily unfolding process. He explained to them that the day of resurrection was the day on which the next stage in this process was revealed to those who were prepared with open minds for it. He explained that heaven and hell were metaphors, not some place up in the sky or down in the earth or something, but metaphors for conditions of the human heart and human consciousness. He dismissed the Sharia completely and the authority of the mullahs along with it. He took the Arabic language. It's very difficult for us in the West to really understand the role that the Arabic language plays in Islam as a religion. According to Muslim traditional thought, the Quran really cannot be translated. You have to learn Arabic to learn the Quran, because the language is so woven into the concepts which it attempts to convey. Well, what the Bab did was to take that language and just stretch it apart, just open it up. If words didn't adequately communicate, so if a particular word didn't adequately communicate a concept that he had, then he would add suffixes to it or prefixes to it, or apply it as a verb instead of as a noun or something. He was free to do this. And after all, the Word of God, we know from all religious history, the Word of God, it is that power that creates grammar, that creates literature, not the other way around. You don't have a bunch of theologians creating a system of grammar, and then God at long last is able to speak to people being very careful to worry about antecedents and so on. But that was one of the things that attracted bright young minds to the Bab, and it was the thing, ironically, that the so-called intellectual leaders of Shia Islam objected to so strongly, and they dismissed the Bab because they said, well, you can't even speak proper Arabic. He could speak proper Arabic by their terms when circumstances required it, but that was not his concern principally. And he also authority of prophethood, use his prophetic authority to gradually wean these followers, these new followers, away from some of the rigid laws that the Quran had contained for an earlier period of history. A good example was jihad. He didn't argue about jihad. He spoke about jihad because that was part of the discourse of the time. But he insisted that jihad could not be used by his followers without his permission. And he refused to give his permission. So there was no jihad. These marches that his followers made across Iran were not attacks. They didn't initiate any kind of hostilities. They were bottled up in Sanjan and in Port Tabarsi and so on. They defended themselves, but they did not exercise the jihad that it was familiar to them from Islamic backgrounds. Well, this is a tragedy, an immense tragedy. And it's a tragedy for the whole of humankind, because once again, and after all, this was not the first time in the evolution of religion, once again, precisely that segment of mankind who had been prepared for the new day by the revelations of the past, that was the very segment that refused it and that attempted to crush it. And the reason, of course, is because, as Baha'u'llah points out, people were willing to submit themselves to the leadership, to the control and direction of a special elite group in the society, the clergy, who were, sadly, the most corrupt, the most ignorant, venal, and really vicious element in the society. The result of that, of course, was that Islamic society began this long descent to the point that today Islamic countries are severely handicapped in any way in responding to the demands of modernity. It's not only Westerners who are today open to whatever modernity requires of them, but the whole world is, whether it's China or India or Latin America. Everybody's open, everybody except Islamic society, the society that should be at the very forefront of that response. It's a tragedy because, yes, these people, the Islamic society, had transformed civilization. They transformed not only their own countries when Muhammad began teaching, they transformed eventually Europe and the rest of the world too. Yes, they had penetrated more deeply into the divine purpose than had the earlier religions, and they applied those teachings as we mentioned last day. And yes, the whole world benefited. Not just Islamic countries benefited from that, but the whole world, usually indirectly, but nevertheless the benefits were experienced by mankind generally. But what they forgot was that what they forgot in our day, as human beings always do, they forgot that this power was the power of God, of the divine revelations. It was not owing to their own superiority as a people over the rest of the people of the world. And the consequence is the catastrophe that religion is bringing on supposedly religion, is bringing on mankind today. That catastrophe that results from ignoring the warning of the Quran, that joining partners with God, elevating ordinary human beings, no matter how educated they are, to the point that they are, and they alone, are the interpreters of the will of God, rather than the fact that people generally should be trained to have access to the Quran or the Bible or the Gospel or something. This acceptance of the control by elite groups is what paralyzes the religious impulse and prevents it from achieving the full effects that are possible. Um, and let me just conclude these comments by reading words of Muhammad in one of the hadiths, the traditions, which is accepted throughout Islam by both Shia and Sunni, and it's very, very sobering. Muhammad warned during his own lifetime. He warned that the day would come when, in his words, there will remain of Islam not but a name, and of the Quran not but a mere appearance. The learned of that day, the ulama, the learned of that day shall be the most evil the world hath seen. Mischief proceedeth from them, and on them it will recoil. I think this might be a good point to pause in our discussions and see if we can take an overview of this whole process of spiritual evolution that is so central to the Baha'i teachings. You know, in evolution generally, I think most people tend to think of evolution as a long, slow, steady, endless rise. But we know, in fact, that the evolutionary process is rather different from that. Indeed, it is a long, slow, steady rise, but then it reaches periods where there's a sudden leap, and then there's another stage following that. I mention that because that's the point, clearly, from the reading of the Baha'i writings, that humanity has reached today, or at least the process of divine revelation has reached. With the appearance of the Bab, what you could call the prophetic cycle in religious revelation came to an end. And that prophetic cycle, well, the iconic or emblematic figure that's been used in scripture in the past to signal the beginning of that process was Adam. Adam, in Baha'i terms, was not the physical progenitor of humankind, but he was the inaugurator of a prophetic series of revelations. And all of the other revelations have followed in due course, and all of them have been prophetic. All of them have apart from developing human character and spiritual consciousness, they have urged mankind to look ahead to the point at which, in the words of Jesus Christ, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In other words, a profound change will take place. It will no longer just be the development of the individual soul. The point will come when mankind at last is able to establish a society on earth which reflects in its collective activities the will of God, not merely in the lives of some or most of its individual members. The Baha'i writings are full of references that you could draw on to study this phenomenon. The Kitab-i-Aqan itself, the whole book virtually is a discussion of these prophetic stages, and Baha'u'llah teaches us to look at them as stages, ascending stages, that lead us closer and closer and closer to the day of fulfillment. Abdul Baha sums the whole, what you could call almost the Baha'i theory of history, up in a few, about 4 pages, as I recall, roughly between page 94 and 98 or so, in Secret of Divine Civilization. But the person who explores the subject most fully, and especially in relation to the history of society in general, is the Guardian. Most Baha'is, I suppose, when they think of the Guardian, they think of his translation of the scriptures, which is obviously the foundation of everything else, or maybe his creation or development of the administrative order, his lands that launched the teaching of the faith in different parts of the world, or the building of the administrative heart of the faith on Mount Carmel at the World Center. The Guardian's work in training us to think historically is so woven into the whole fabric of Baha'i belief and Baha'i consciousness that sometimes you just take it for granted. You don't stop and think about it as a phenomenon in and of itself. But that's exactly what it was. He devoted an unbelievable amount of time and energy to helping us to think historically. The one book that he wrote, of course, is God Passes By, is the authentic history of the Babi and the Baha'i religions during that first century and century of their existence. Then he translated a large part of Nabil's narrative. That is a staggering task. I don't think generally people have no conception of the work that this must have involved, translating this vast volume, which itself is only about half of what Nabil wrote, into English so that it's available to the bulk of Baha'is in the world. And then he moved his attention also to the development of the Baha'i faith generally in relation to world history. And so you've got world order letters, in which he moves easily back and forth through the great episodes of world history in the 19th century through World War I and so on. And then subsidiary texts like, Promised Day Has Come, where the focus is more specifically institutional, religious, and governmental, and parts at least of Advent of Divine Justice, which tend to focus on American history. In any event, as we read these books, as we study them at summer schools and so on, we think historically, but we think automatically historically. I think I said that at an earlier stage in this series. Well, now we've arrived at a point in this whole process where we have to begin to shift gears. And what I'd like to do is to read one of the most exciting statements, in my view, that the Guardian, he made so many exciting statements, but this one is a very unusual statement, because what he does is to take an overview of the whole of human history, well, at least of spiritual history, from the time of Adam to the ultimate golden age, or the completion of the golden age of Baha'u'llah's dispensation. So let me just read this to you. Now, this statement was made as I recall, in 1952-53, as he was launching the 10-year crusade. And in it, he takes a look at the whole of human history as a 10-part process. And he says that the process, because we're talking about the spiritual process, began 6,000 years ago with the planting in the soil of the divine will of the tree of revelation. So revelation began at this point, prophetic revelation. And he says it passed through certain stages and must needs pass through others. The first part of this process, the first part of a 10-part process, was the slow and steady growth of this tree of divine revelation through a series of progressive dispensations associated with Moses, Zoroaster, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, and other prophets, and the sacrifice of martyrs during the course of this process. And we're talking here about, 6,000 years almost alone in the first part. The second part of the process was the fruition of the tree, to quote the Quran, that belonged neither to the east nor the west, when the Bab appeared as the perfect fruition and declared his mission in the year 60. So the second part, the first part, some 6,000 years, the second part are the few years of the Bab's life. The third part was the grinding of this sacred seed of infinite preciousness in the mill of adversity, causing it to yield its oil 6 years later in the city of Tabriz. We're talking here about the martyrdom of the Bab, and this is an event that occurred on a single day. So now we're talking about a single day at the heart of this process. The fourth part was the ignition of this oil by the hand of providence in the depths and amidst the darkness of the Siachal of Tehran. So now we're talking about a single night, the process. This is the fourth part. The fifth was the clothing of that flickering light. He's talking here about the formal declaration of Baha'u'llah to a handful of his followers at the Garden of Rizwan. The sixth was the spreading radiance of that light, shining with added brilliancy in its crystal globe in Adrianople. Here we've arrived at the point of the formal declaration of Baha'u'llah's mission to the kings and religious leaders of the world. The seventh was its projection from the most great prison in the course of the ministry of the Center of the Covenant across the seas. And we're talking now, we've come to the mission of the ministry of Abdu'l-Baha, taking it right as far as the Australian continent. The eighth part of the process, and here the typical modesty of the guardian comes into play. He talks about the eighth part as being the gradual diffusion of that light during the course of two plans, which he himself had created, to various countries of the world which it had yet reached. And then he says, the ninth part of this process, the stage we are now entering, this is 1952-53, is the diffusion of that same light over 131 additional territories and islands in both the eastern and western hemispheres through the operations of a decade-long world spiritual crusade, whose termination will, God willing, coincide with the most great jubilee, the completion of the preparation for the election of the Universal House of Justice. Now, this is the point at which this document was written. He's writing it to the people who are going to go and do this, to literally plant the faith in every single remaining country and major dependency and major island and territory of the globe. And then he says, and finally, the 10th part of this mighty process must be the penetration of that light in the course of numerous crusades and successive epochs of both the formative and golden ages of the faith into all the remaining areas of the globe through the erection of the entire machinery of Baha'u'llah's administrative order, and so on. And here we're talking about at least 1,000 years. So what's so interesting about this, he starts with the first part of a 10-part process being 6,000 years. Then the next is the few years of the Bab's life. The next is the single day, the Bab's execution. The next is a single night with the illumination and with Baha'u'llah's beginning of Baha'u'llah's mission in the Siachal, and it gives the time extends farther and farther and farther through the work of Abdu'l-Baha and so on. And now this is written to people who are going to extend it throughout the whole world. And then the concluding part, again, we're talking in terms of centuries or perhaps millennia, it's not clear. I find the document so interesting because it gives us perspective. It's not only necessary that we have a sense of the spiritual evolution of the revelations of God and the transformation of human nature and so on. It's also necessary that we keep a perspective, that we know where we are at any given point and what's important at that point. And obviously, for the people who went out on these enormously difficult projects, pioneers during the 10-year crusade, all over the globe, it was vital that they understood the importance, and not only the importance of what they were doing, but the fact that these opportunities would never come again. Because if they hadn't done that, chunks of of the world and large bodies of mankind would not have been exposed directly to the revelation of Baha'u'llah. So because of that ninth part, now we can look back and we can see national assemblies, local assemblies, institutes, the present plan role in all of these countries, and that all of that process in any given country, Uruguay or Senegal or whatever country you want to speak about, came through the work of that one person or a couple of persons who responded at that particular point. So the point of the whole thing, obviously, is to recognize the fact that the challenges now are for the individual. No longer are we in a period of history where whole nations and collections of mankind are going to fail to recognize the revelation of God. We're now in the day of fulfillment. This is no longer the day of prophecy. And it's up to the individual now in a far more mature way than would have been possible, I suppose, in previous periods of history, to recognize where the process has brought him and to take the decisions that are necessary to the advancement of the cause. And let me just conclude this by reading another passage of the Guardian, one that's one of my favorites, which puts this in perspective so far as the stage that we're moving steadily through now. He says, the revelation of Baha'u'llah, whose supreme mission is none other but the achievement of the organic and spiritual unity of the whole body of nations, should, if we be faithful to its implications, be regarded as signalizing through its advent the coming of age of the entire human race. This is what the revelation of Baha'u'llah brings. It should be viewed not merely as yet another spiritual revival in the ever-changing fortunes of mankind, not only as a further stage in a chain of progressive revelations, i.e. not just another prophetic religion, nor even as the culmination of one of a series of prophetic cycles, because it was the Bab that completed that cycle and opened up the new cycle. So this is something above and beyond this entirely. But rather as marking the last and highest stage in the stupendous evolution of man's collective life on this planet. The emergence of a world community, the consciousness of world citizenship, the founding of a world civilization, should by their very nature be regarded as far as this planetary life is concerned as the furthermost limits in the organization of human society. Though man as individual will, indeed must, as a result of such a consummation, continue indefinitely to progress and develop spiritually. So I thought this would be helpful before we move into the next stage of our discussion, when we want to take a look at the revelation of Baha'u'llah itself. So far we've been talking about what we've called the prophetic cycle in religion, in religious history. A cycle in which one prophet after another foretold the coming of what in Christian terms is the kingdom of God on earth. And last time we were focused on the role of the Bab in closing that cycle and in opening what has been called the cycle of fulfillment. And so and that means the fact that what we are engaged in today, we Baha'is, is the building of the foundations of this kingdom. Now, what one has to remember, I think, is that what is probably the case with most members of the major faiths that you can think of, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, the coming of the the day of judgment or the establishment of the kingdom of heaven or whatever, was something that was going to take place on another realm entirely, in some sort of metaphysical realm. It wasn't presented, it wasn't understood as something that humanity itself is going to be very much involved in. It was going to be done for humanity, or if you like, to humanity, and then humanity would benefit from it. That's clearly not at all what the Baha'i dispensation entails. And so what I'd like to do, perhaps before going any further, is reading a couple of sentences from Baha'u'llah, which discuss this day and its implications. He says, "The purpose underlying all creation is the revelation of this most sublime, this most holy day, the day known as the day of God in his books and scriptures. This is the day in which God's most excellent favors have been poured out upon man, the day in which his most mighty grace hath been infused in all created things." And he gives a very interesting analogy. "This day a door is opened wider than both heaven and earth. An act, however infinitesimal, is, when viewed in the mirror of the knowledge of God, mightier than a mountain." So we're talking about something entirely different. It was the Bab who inaugurated this cycle, but the Day of Fulfillment is the Baha'i dispensation. It is the work of Baha'u'llah. He is not merely inaugurating it. The work that he has done has already begun to lay the foundations. And what all religion has always understood is that when this day comes, one of its, in fact, perhaps its most distinguishing feature is the unity of mankind. On that day there will be one fold and one shepherd. Mankind will be one people, or at least, I suppose, people of many of other religions would have said the saved, at least, would be members of a single community and inhabiting the city of God, which would have descended out of heaven. Well, how is this unity to be achieved? If unity is the characteristic of the Day of God, Baha'u'llah makes a very, very challenging statement. He says the instrument that achieves unity, it's not love, it's not any of these other highly positive qualities that people have come to cherish in religion in the past. It is justice. This is the day of justice. Justice, it is justice in human affairs that will produce unity. Very much like in the development of a human being, when he arrives at the point of maturity and he can accept responsibility, something different happens to him. He has taken charge of his own life, of his own future, his own relationship with other people. Justice is that point in the collective life of mankind, the operation of justice in human affairs. The proof of the power of justice to bring about unity, the unarguable proof, is the existence of the Baha'i community. Without wanting to sound, I guess one is going to sound extravagant perhaps, because God is pretty extravagant, and certainly what he's doing in this day is very extravagant. The Baha'i community is a miracle. It's unique. There is no association of human beings, whether it's religious, political, social, whatever you want to call it, on earth today that has survived even its early years, let alone its later years, with its unity intact. The blight of faction and sect and denomination and party is universal. And it's not only today, of course, it's throughout history. Never before has there existed on earth a community of people, and particularly one drawn from the whole diversity of humankind, that functions as one organized community. And in the process of achieving that goal, Baha'is have seen the old threat of sectarianism completely defeated. Sectarianism can no more survive in a Baha'i context, in a Baha'i society, a Baha'i community life, then earthworms or bugs could survive in the bright sunlight of a noonday. And they never have. And so if you take a look at Baha'i history, and it's very useful for anybody who is interested in this subject to take a look at some of the passages, say the last third of the Guardian's book, God Passes By, and you see the complete dissolution of every single attempt to break up the Baha'i community in different parties or different factions or so on. The Baha'i community, therefore, is the proof, and again, let me say the unarguable proof, that humanity in all its diversity can learn to live and work as one human family in one global homeland, which is the planet itself. And you can't argue with this. You can't say that's not possible for people, and a lot of people, I guess, who say that today, because some 5 million people, with the whole diversity of the human race entailed, have done it quite successfully. And as the community grows, the strengths that come from unity, as Baha'u'llah promised would be the case, have steadily increased. So, in a sense, you could say, in an important sense, I think, it's fair to say that the Baha'i community is a model. At the very least, it's an encouraging model to others who are hoping that humanity can overcome this propensity to war and so on, and create a global society. And let me give you, it's worthwhile pausing, I think, to take a couple of examples. We take the law of Hukuk-Allah in the Baha'i faith. Now, Hukuk-Allah is an expression of divine justice. As for the rest of our lives, we give to the cause what we want to do. We give whatever, each one of us gives whatever he or she chooses to give. He or she gives it in complete confidentiality and feels perfectly at one with God in doing so, because God said that this is exactly what we're free to do. However, there is one additional feature in this whole area of human activity, and that is this law of Hukuk-Allah, or the right of God. Because God is pretty smart. He realizes that I, for example, or anybody else, when I think of giving a contribution to the Baha'i Fund, I will tend to favor those things that are closest to me, my own locality, my own national community. And they get the bulk of the funds I contribute, but then I give a smaller amounts, perhaps to continental or international funds. Well, God isn't satisfied with that, because the result of that, obviously, is that Baha'i communities that are in wealthy nations will prosper, will never have any problem drawing funds, or at least they won't have a lot of problem in drawing the funds necessary to accomplish what they want. What about the rest of humanity, where the societies themselves, the economies, are at the bottom of the heap? And law of Hukuk-Allah is the means by which God plans to take care of that, because each Baha'i, when he gives to the trustees of this fund 19% of everything that he has left after he has paid all his own expenses, after he has lived as he feels he should live, 19% goes to this, and those funds are used for the whole progress of the faith throughout the whole world. Now, these are early days, but what we're talking about, if you throw your imagination into the future, we are talking here about a massive transfer of capital in a Baha'i society on a scale that would boggle the mind today if you began to think of it. Baha'u'llah simply intends to establish justice in the distribution of human wealth without taking away the rights of people in parts of the world which have money, lots of money, to function in every other aspect of their lives as their own particular inclination prompts them to do. What's another example? Well, take Baha'i elections. Here, if two people, if when the votes are counted, and there's a tie vote between one person and a second person who represents some minority, some disadvantaged minority in that particular society, the latter person automatically is elected. You could say that's very arbitrary, but the purpose of it obviously is to assist and encourage disadvantaged minorities to catch up with the rest of society. And what is entailed in all of these examples is authority. We have arrived at the point in human history where authority is going to be exercised in a way that not only is beneficial and positive for the future of humankind, but is going to be recognizable as such as people at least give it a chance. Because whatever else one can say, authority is absolutely essential to any organized activity. We live in an age when people are in full flight from authority, whether it's parental authority or religious authority, political, whatever, educational, and so on. And that's understandable, perhaps, to some degree at least, because of the way authority has been abused. But it doesn't change the fact that without authority, nothing is possible. No organized activity is possible, and the conditions under which humanity would have to live in a society without it are unimaginable. Let me just give you one other example before I go on, and that's in Baha'i consultation. Here you have a law of consultation, the exercise, quite a clear exercise of authority on the part of Baha'u'llah, in which a decision is taken after consultation, and there may be a minority of people who don't agree, but they are required then to support it. There's no place for Her Majesty's loyal opposition in the functioning of Baha'i consultation. But at the same time, the whole group, the institution that has made this decision, including obviously the majority who have voted for it, must also be ready and willing and open to examining the consequences of the decision, so that if it proves to be faulty, they will be equally, as much as the other people, they will be ready to abandon their attachment to it and accept a reconsideration of the principle that's under discussion. Now, obviously, God's love and God's mercy are going to continue to be at the very heart of the Baha'i dispensation, as they have throughout religious history, because that's the nature of God. God is loving. God is merciful. The only thing that keeps us from experiencing His love and His mercy, Baha'u'llah says, is because we ourselves are not loving. If we are loving, then that love reaches us. But this does not change the fact that in this new dispensation, this dispensation of fulfillment, it is justice that is the really ruling principle of the conduct of human affairs. And it is that ruling principle because it is through justice, as I've said, that unity is achieved. And unity is the absolute requirement of any future development of civilization. So all of the context of all of this, of everything I've been saying, is the collective coming of age of humankind. And the coming of age of humankind collectively, as with an individual, is the requirement to grow up. We are being challenged, we as a people on this planet are being challenged to grow up, to mature, to accept responsibility, to accept the fact that some of our behavior has to be disciplined, that, for example, Baha'u'llah says that all of the natural wealth of the planet belongs to the entire human race. And if this makes us uncomfortable, it's getting out of our comfort zone is going to be part of growing up. We experience it in our personal lives. Why would we expect not to experience it in our collective life? But because we're rational souls, we have to do our very best, I think, as Baha'is, not merely to obey, not merely to submit, but as I think I mentioned in another context, but to understand why and how these evolutionary processes work, and to keep in mind constantly that we're not talking just about other people. If we're going to be useful to the human race, if we're going to provide a model, if we're going to provide encouragement, then we have to understand that we ourselves will be facing these challenges first. And we will not be useful if we have not responded to these challenges. That's what's ahead of us. The very fact that the cause is a stage in an evolutionary process, even though it's at a moment, the stage where everything has changed, everything has reached a moment of fulfillment. Nevertheless, it's a process that we're challenged to look at, and if we ever fall into the habit of imagining that we have arrived and the rest of poor mankind is still struggling in the darkness, then we ourselves have missed the boat completely. It's to the extent that we face the inevitable challenges that authority presents us with. The minute you encounter authority, you are challenged. You are challenged to begin to think, why is this authority, do I understand what the authority is requiring? Do I understand why that authority is requiring it? Am I imagining that here I'm still dealing with my father or something, or my grade 1 school teacher? No, authority is the authority that God has, the authority I'm speaking about, is the authority that God has expressed for the guidance of mankind. And that's the goal that we have constantly to keep in mind. Let me just close these comments, which are perhaps too extensive already, but all of the great religions have pointed us to the enormity of the changes that are taking place today. In the past, I think people have tended to think of the coming of the kingdom of heaven or the descent of God out of heaven, as in Islam, as something that would take place in some sort of a metaphysical realm in which things are just done for us, and we accept it and benefit from it. But that's not the kind of actual wording of even of the prophetic scriptures. The Bible says, in that day the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established at the top of the mountains, and all nations shall flow unto it. This is very much something above this world. It's not some realm out in space, up in the sky or so on. The same thing is true in the gospel. St. John says, and I saw the holy city coming down from God out of heaven, and the glory of the Lord shall be its light. It will be here on earth. It will be, he compares it to a city, and the light that he's speaking of, obviously, is the light of understanding that will make possible for people to live together as one global society. And the Quran extends this, as it very often does, to in one sweep to the whole of the planet. It says, even as we produced the first creation, so shall we produce a new one. A promise we shall certainly fulfill. Well, as we all know, the heart of Baha'u'llah's message is unity. The concept that, in his words, speaking to mankind, ye are all the leaves of one tree, the fruit of one branch. And to some extent, during the course of his own ministry, he developed or applied this principle in a number of fields, like the relations between men and women or races and so on. But principally, he left that task to Abdu'l-Baha, to the center of the covenant. This is a role that Abdu'l-Baha played that I think still we are only beginning to understand the importance of. For example, if you consider past history, that the story of human beings in the past could hardly be termed the story of humankind. These were the stories of different races, different tribes, different nations, different religions, different cultures, and so on. But you could not truthfully say that there was, throughout those 6,000 years or so, there was something you could have called humanity, nor indeed were many of these people prepared to see themselves that way. Even physically, as we all know, races regarded other races as inferior, or perhaps not even as complete or subhuman. But particularly was this true of the actual world in which the human soul lives, the rational soul of man. The rational soul of man lives, as we know, not just in the physical world that his body occupies, but he lives in a world of intellect, he lives in a world of emotion, aesthetics, of morality, spirituality, and so on. That's the real culture, where humanity finds its real identity. And therefore there were many, many identities. Because the cultures of mankind throughout what we today call mankind so easily were, as the Revelation of St. John suggests, they were isolated continents. People were separated from one another, and they were separated by choice. They felt quite happy to be separated from one another. And this was the conditions of mankind when Baha'u'llah appeared. And it's the recognition of this historical reality that we have to appreciate as the background for our attempt to understand the mission of Abdu'l-Baha. Baha'u'llah, in making his covenant, essentially made the covenant with Abdu'l-Baha because there was no one else on earth. There was no other fully human being with whom he could have made that covenant. And Abdu'l-Baha's commitment under the covenant was to bring into being that humankind, to bring into being, in his words, a new race of man. And he would do this by unfolding and applying the teachings of the manifestation of God for this age. And this is what he succeeded in doing. He created, for those who wanted to embrace it, he created a universal identity. And we Baha'is are struggling to fully internalize this, of course, today. Now, the enemies of the faith said, no, he hasn't done this at all. What he's done is to create a wholly new religion. They sought to picture him as someone who had been dazzled by the West and therefore used his father's revelation as a sort of a foundation, I guess you could call, for the creation of a sort of a socio-political religion of his own devising. Well, Professor E.G. Brown pretty well kills this argument when he points out, in response to some of these charges, no, he says these fundamental teachings, and he gives examples, are already in the revelation of Baha'u'llah. It's that Abdu'l-Baha took them, developed them fully, and applied them. But the fact that the enemies of the faith chose this particular charge to make is very revealing about them. Or perhaps it's better to say it's very revealing about humankind. And what it reveals is our ignorance still of the nature and importance and power of unity. The Guardian emphasizes this when he's addressing the attempt of modern civilization to deal with all kinds of problems of racial conflict, problems of the misuse of the material resources of the planet, the suppression of women, and all of these other issues that we're struggling with today. The point that he was making is that these problems are the symptoms. The fundamental disease, the disease that needs to be addressed directly, is disunity. Because once unity is created, then the other problems become solvable. Without the establishment of the unity of humankind, these problems are not going to be solved, because all of the problems we're facing today in our world are global. We went through periods of history where we were concerned about principally our national problems or our national identity or whatever the case may be. But today we're living in a world where economic difficulties suddenly sweep across the whole planet. Same thing with the consequences of environmental difficulties, or the breakdown of moral principles. Whole populations, refugee populations, sweeping back and forth across the planet, creating problems that you cannot isolate in any one particular country or one particular society. Now, we Baha'is, we've learned to love Abdu'l-Baha, to appreciate Abdu'l-Baha in terms of the example he provides, in terms of the love and encouragement that he provided to followers of Baha'u'llah. We've done the same thing with respect to the institutions whose nature is spelled out and authority is assigned quite clearly in Abdu'l-Baha's Will and Testament. But we have to increasingly learn to appreciate equally deeply the particular evolutionary role that Abdu'l-Baha's mission played in the history of the Baha'i faith. When I say played, I mean it set it in motion, and the basis upon which it was set in motion, the writings of Abdu'l-Baha, the Will and Testament principally, indicate, of course, that influence will continue on throughout the Baha'i dispensation. Abdu'l-Baha, you could say, almost introduces us to the whole concept of the evolutionary principle as it applies to the spiritual life of mankind and to the development of civilization. Why is that so important? Well, we now recognize that we have reached a point in the history of the planet where we are seeing the disintegration, the breakdown of civilization itself, principally Western civilization, but since it is one world now, is one planet now, the breakdown of those other cultures that have been profoundly influenced by Western civilization and have tried to adapt themselves to it. And the challenge to us as Baha'is is that we are going to need a far deeper understanding, a far deeper capacity to internalize the teachings of Baha'u'llah if we're going to be of any earthly use to the rest of humankind, which is, after all, the mission that Baha'u'llah has given us. And this understanding will come only through, obviously, first of all, the guidance of the leadership that the Master established for us. The guardianship, which defines for us the nature of reality in the Guardian's interpretation of Baha'u'llah's purpose and Abdu'l-Baha's writings, and today the Universal House of Justice, whose the protection of whom from error applies to the decision-making that's necessary for the global functioning of the Baha'i community now and throughout the centuries or millennia, perhaps, that are yet to come. And that, in turn, means a process of learning that is going to be the very essence of the development of the Baha'i community, a process of, through learning, a process of developing capacities that are latent in us, but that must be brought to the surface fully. These are moral capacities, intellectual, organizational, capacities of even aesthetics, for that matter, because the manifestation of God, whom we believe in and love, has called himself the Blessed Beauty. So it's not only the organization and the transformation morally of society, but there must be the power of beauty must suffuse that result as we gradually learn to make that possible. And this learning is going to, in turn, to create, to drive the development of the evolution of the Baha'i community and the evolution of our own thought. And so the challenge to us is to be open, because, human beings resist change. Change is not what we want. We get a comfort zone and we want to stay there. That's exactly what we are going to have to, that lethargy, as the House of Justice called it in its recent Rizwan message, has to be overcome. We have to not only be open to change, we have to embrace change. We have to embrace it eagerly. We have to see it as an adventure, as a process of fulfillment, that whatever we think we need is going to come through giving ourselves to change. Abdul Baha says, I may have already mentioned this in one of the earlier sessions, in speaking to us as a community about the task that Baha'u'llah has given us. He says, you must become the very soul of the world. The Baha'i community must become the very soul of the world. You must become God's mercy to mankind. You must become God's grace. He says in another passage, rise up with such qualities and attitudes that you will become the soul of the world, the spirit and the body of man, and you will lead this young child humanity to the stage of its adulthood. That's our job. Very, very frightening, a very intimidating challenge to us, but the manifestation of God sets that before us as the goal towards which we are gradually going to evolve, and the capacities necessary we're going to gradually develop. Why do you, I don't know, of course, none of us, the rest of us are interpreters of Baha'u'llah or Abdul Baha indeed, but the metaphor of the soul is extremely interesting because, there are two things about the human soul. First of all, it's the only thing about us that survives eternally intact. The body and everything related to it dissolves, and the parts of it and so on break up, and so do the molecules and so on. But the soul is eternal. The soul endures. The second thing about the soul is that it is the only thing about us that connects us with God, that connects us with the spiritual world. And then you look at the aptitude of this particular metaphor for the role of the Baha'i community collectively in the fortunes of mankind. First of all, its unity. It is the only association of human beings, not only in the world today, but ever in the whole history of this planet, that has remained absolutely united. It is one single body. It has no sects, it has no factions, it has no parties, and all the efforts to introduce these breaks, which had succeeded always in the past, have failed. And they will always go on failing because the covenant has demonstrated its capacity to ensure this. The second thing about the Baha'i community is that it is the only phenomenon in civilization today that is in direct contact with the will of God, because it is the only community of people who have recognized God's message for today, God's plan for humanity, and the principles that must guide this. And so when Abdul Baha challenges us to become the very soul of the world, he's speaking about a capacity that is demonstrated in us. We have this capacity, but to realize it is going to take us through stages, some of which may be very, certainly intimidating to us, some of them may be very frightening. But that's the process of evolution, and it's a process that is at the very heart of the cause of God. Well, as we're all keenly aware, perhaps the greatest blessing of the covenant of Baha'u'llah is his gift to his community and to mankind in due course of an infallibly guided leadership, the guardianship, and the Universal House of Justice, functioning successively as head of the faith. And as an evolutionary process unfolds under the guidance of the head of the faith, it creates for us who are so attached to our own particular conception of the cause at any given stage, it creates for us successive series of tests, and these tests free us from our unexamined preconceptions about what Baha'u'llah really means and so on. Because after all, we're fallible human beings. We have very limited experience at the best of times. And we create, having we read the teachings and seeing the example of the friends around us, trying to follow the guidance of the head of the faith, we create our understanding at any given point. And constantly we have to go through a process of setting some of these cherished assumptions aside, because whole new dimensions of the faith open up for us. And that's the nature of reality. The nature of reality is that it is constantly unfolding to minds that are by their very nature limited. Well, I think it may help our discussion of this highly theoretical subject if we take a look at least one stage of the process that brought us where we are right now. And this happens to be a very critical stage. I'm thinking of the first half of the 20th century. And to do that, it's helpful to start off by, to the best of our ability anyway, trying to get a sense of the Baha'i community that existed before the guardianship, during the ministry of Abdu'l-Baha, the community that the guardian inherited, you could say, from Abdu'l-Baha. And it's very difficult for us to do this because that community was so different from anything that we know today. It was, you could call it an arena for free-ranging speculation. Baha'is enthusiastically were given over to belief in spiritualism and various forms of theosophy, in astrology, hand writing, the reading of handwriting, the reading of dreams, and so on. And I won't go into details, but there were some very prominent Baha'is who gave courses in this kind of thing, or told you what your aura was, and then gave you a name for that would be in harmony with your particular aura. It would have been impossible, most certainly, had there been any impulse toward the creation of an international convention to regularize what Baha'i beliefs were. It would have been possible to arrive at any rational perception at all of this nature, because all of these things were contradictory. People, indeed individuals, held up views that were completely contradictory one to another, to say nothing of the contradictions that separated different views in community and entertained people, no doubt, because it was all basically quite harmless. It was harmless because the Baha'i faith was Abdu'l-Baha, and the Baha'is didn't need something else. It's little wonder that many of them felt that the Abdu'l-Baha was the return of Christ. It gave him great difficulty in trying to explain to them that that was not the case, and the guardian had to pick that challenge up later on. But it's little wonder that they felt like that because of this immensely appealing figure. The very embodiment of spiritual reality to anybody who came in contact with him. Even his letters, even a few lines from a letter. There are many stories about this. His letters, the pilgrimages people paid to Haifa, the pilgrims' reports then, which were actually published and widely diffused, Abdu'l-Baha's own travels, and the tireless love and encouragement that he showered on everybody. You know, we all are familiar with these stories of after he had given talks and then staying up until 2 o'clock in the morning with a series of people still waiting to talk to him about their own particular spiritual search. He created, his very existence created an intimacy with God that was totally satisfying to the spiritual desires and needs of the Baha'i community in all its diversity. And then, with the passing of the heroic age, the apostolic age, his own death in 1921, the guardianship emerged. And suddenly there was, really in very short order, despite the gentleness that the guardian applied to his own communications, there was a revolutionary change in what people understood the Baha'i cause consisted of and what it required. There was for those who went on pilgrimage, there was a focus now not on the guardian. He refused that. There was a focus now on the shrines. The authority on which communities functioned was not some individual who might have a particularly strong personality or so on, but an administrative order with local assemblies, and people had to get used to the idea that when an assembly made a decision, this was the authority that should be accepted by the community. There were laws. I mean, everybody had understood for a long time that Baha'u'llah and the Akdas itself discouraged the use of alcohol and drugs and so on. But the guardian made this a requirement of being a Baha'i who could be satisfied that he really was acting in accordance with the will of Baha'u'llah. He called on Baha'is to leave their churches and synagogues, because up until that time, that was not a particularly important issue in a religion which emphasized very strongly its acceptance of all religions. You could easily mix up a particular church or sect or denomination with what Baha'u'llah meant when he was speaking about religion. Baha'is were required to stop involvement in political activities, withdraw from political parties and so on. Probably one of the most dramatic changes was the sudden introduction of a series of plans. Under the guardianship, 2 plans, and then the 10-year crusade, so that things were done collectively and systematically. All of this was a very different world, and I think we have to try and understand our Baha'i predecessors, the challenge this must have represented for them. Possibly the greatest of all the challenges was the one the guardian laid before them at a very relatively early stage, when he called on them to, in his words, vindicate the independent character of the Baha'i faith as an independent world religion. Well, how was it going to happen? I mean, how could a community of the kind I've described, how could they possibly conceive that they were able to establish their body of beliefs as a religion on the same level, which is what the guardian was calling for, as Judaism, Christianity, Islam, which had existed for centuries or millennia? The guardian set them off on that. He provided the leadership. He, for example, when a Sunni Muslim court in Egypt deprived 3 Baha'i men of their wives because the wives were supposedly Muslim, the court said that no, the Baha'i faith was not Islamic, it was not a sect of Islam, it was a completely separate religion, and therefore these divorces were endorsed. Well, naturally, the Baha'i community was distressed, to say nothing of husbands, one assumes. But the guardian said, no, look at this in the long term. We have been, the independent character of the faith has been attested to by an accepted Muslim ecclesiastical court. And that court decision has been quoted many, many times in the years since then. Certainly, I'm sure to the horror of the mullahs who were involved in it, who are now in the next world and able to observe what actually was going on. In Baghdad, Shia Muslims had seized the most holy house, the center of Baha'i pilgrimage, and the government refused. Really, it broke its own promise to the League of Nations that it would cause the Shias to give the house back to the Baha'is. The Baha'i community was greatly distressed. The Guardian said, "Stop and think. Our case has been taken up by the highest civil authority that humanity in 6,000 years has ever managed to create. It has taken it up, it has taken it very seriously, it has studied it, and it is found in favor of the Baha'is. We are the aggrieved and wronged parties, and it has made a judgment. The fact that the judgment has been ignored by those who misbehaved in this fashion doesn't change the significance of what has happened." He called for Baha'i marriage to be recognized. That meant fundamental changes in many jurisdictions, because marriage has been conducted by priests and rabbis and ministers and so on. Now suddenly laws were going to have to be adjusted to accept the decisions of collective bodies, namely local spiritual assemblies, who would perform these marriages. He called for Baha'is to ask for holiday leave on Baha'i holy days, so that that particular Baha'i institution would be recognized in consequence, and the same thing in the schools. Baha'is themselves got into the spirit of the whole thing, and we created something called World Religion Day, which had never existed before, the third Sunday of January. And to our surprise, this was very warmly received by many other elements in society. People loved the idea of a World Religion Day where you'd get a rabbi and a priest and a minister and some Oriental dignitary and a Baha'i together to talk about the oneness of religion. We began very nervously, but insistently, under the Guardian's guidance, to urge the inclusion of Baha'i readings in elementary and high school curricula, and the same thing at a higher level in university, this creation of materials that could be used for courses in comparative religion. The Guardian, acting through one of the national assemblies, enlisted the support of various prominent personalities who attested to the independence of the cause. The one that occurs to me is Arnold Toynbee, the world's probably leading authority at that time on comparative religion, who agreed to write under his own signature to the government of Turkey, I think it was, explaining in his words that the Baha'i faith was an independent religion, to stand on the same level as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. A tremendous coup. And of course the fact, our own education. We ourselves had to be educated to see the Baha'i faith in this way, rather than in some narrow personalized view of it that we might have otherwise have developed for ourselves. And the temples and so on. All of this effort, this highly complex effort that influenced so many different areas of human life, eventually produced the total success of the mission that the Guardian had assigned. For myself, the whole thing came into sharpest focus. I'll never forget. I think it was in the late 1980s, for reasons that we didn't understand. The Vatican had invited the Baha'i World Center to send representatives to discuss with it, in its words, the formalization of relationships, institutional relationships between the Vatican and the Baha'i World Center. And so I was very privileged to be one of the representatives. Secretary of the Italian NSA was the other one. And we went to this beautiful palazzo just at the entrance to St. Peter's Square to meet a cardinal and an archbishop who were the representatives of the leaders of the particular department of the Vatican that dealt with interfaith affairs of various kinds. Before they ever came into the room, we noticed that in this large reception room was a great display with a huge circle in the center and multicolored. And around the circle were 9 smaller circles. And each one of these smaller circles, which was a different color from the others, had a symbol in it. There was the Star of David and the cross and the crescent. And then we realized the violet-colored circle up in the top left-hand corner, I still remember it, had a 9-pointed star. We rushed over to the exhibition, and we saw that the central circle was the calendar of the year, 365 days of the year. And so we immediately looked for the violet-colored rays, and sure enough, there was Nowruz and Rizwan and the martyrdom of the Bab and the birth of Baha'u'llah and so on. Well, this was incredible. The meeting turned out to be pointless, completely pointless. I don't recall the details of the discussion we had, which led nowhere. And in any event, it didn't matter, because here at the heart of Christianity, the Guardian's call for the vindication of the independence character of the Baha'i faith had been fully achieved. This recognition you couldn't have asked, sort of like the cherry on the top, I suppose you could say, of the sundae. And now it's no longer in question. The independent character of the faith as a world religion is not in serious question any place and a part of any part of the civilized world. I use civilized in a general sense of countries and societies that are not dominated by some ideology or private theology. Now, what does all this mean? What it means is that the Baha'i community, because many of the Baha'is in the Baha'i community under the leadership of the Guardian were naturally people who had been Baha'is maybe all their lives, and certainly many of them during the ministry of Abdu'l-Baha. The transformation in the experience of the Baha'i faith by the Baha'i, on the part of the Baha'is themselves, is staggering to contemplate. The idea that you have a faith that is seen by everybody else as a cult, along with all kinds of other cults, and gradually and systematically and with tremendous success, it has burst that whole, those limitations and become an independent world religion, functioning as all of the other world religions. And even though it is only a few years old compared with, in historic time, compared with these other ones. One reflection, I suppose, that immediately comes to mind is that it had become impossible for Baha'is to think themselves back into the Baha'i faith that they had originally been members of, or that perhaps that their parents had talked about, that they may have been raised in. That faith in the period of Abdu'l-Baha's ministry had vanished into history where it belongs, and an entirely different conception of the Baha'i faith had emerged that called on the Baha'is to be far more audacious, far more confident, far more creative than anything that they could have imagined in the past. Well, this is one period, one hugely important period, obviously, in the evolution of the cause. But the process doesn't end there. The process is going to go on throughout the whole history of the cause in the future. Already, even at this point, at the beginning of this new century, the cause, under the guidance of the Universal House of Justice, has moved into, I can think of at least 2 major stages, I guess you could call them, which required us to stretch our imaginations in ways we had never conceived of doing before. With the emergence of the House of Justice itself, with the tremendous triumphs that we enjoyed during the last decade of the 20th century, when the United Nations focused on basically Baha'u'llah's teachings. But now we are right now moving into an enormously demanding new stage, a stage that will test us to our very limits, and that will be immensely exciting and fulfilling for all of us who embrace it. Well, this is the concluding session of this series, and we've been looking at the spiritual evolution of humankind, the evolution of spiritual consciousness in humankind, a process that's been driven by the progressive revelation of the divine will through the manifestations of God. And in doing so, we've been struck by two circumstances. The first of these, they're not the most attractive features of it by any means, but the first of these has been the tendency of humankind from the beginning, at every stage, to build a kind of stockade around their conception of the divine purpose and separate, and so that one, quote, religion would be separated from a successive religion and so on. And this, of course, has added to the divisions that already afflict the unity of humankind. But a further and very sobering, very, very sobering feature of this process has been the fact that over and over again, the people the segment of humankind who had been most spiritually advantaged, who had been the best prepared to respond to the next stage of the evolution, strangely enough, they themselves became the most rigid opponents of that process. In fact, they did this, of course, because their own leaders arrived at the point that they felt that they were threatened, that their power or their station in society or their wealth, whatever it was, and Baha'u'llah suggests there were different motivations. Because of this, these most advantaged people were the least capable of responding. And the Bible, of course, tells us that in that day the first will be last and the last will be first. Well, unfortunately, we have seen this phenomenon played out repeatedly throughout religious history. And as a result, Baha'u'llah over and over and over again throughout his writings calls for us to take a particular action, which is obviously very central to his purpose, central to the purpose of the evolution of human consciousness. He repeatedly says, reflect, consider, ponder, why, what would have led people to do so and so. So obviously, this is central. It should be central to our experience of our religion. This is not, religion is not something that should encourage us to simply settle down in some kind of a comfort zone. We're supposed to think, we're supposed to learn. Now, throughout all of this, despite all of the difficulties, the divine purpose itself was not deterred. The spiritualization of consciousness continued. The maturation of the human race went on. It was inhibited, it was delayed, and so on. But nevertheless, that process also continued to the present day, in which we have arrived at a stage in human history where the human race at last is able to see itself as one single people. Whether they like it, whether everybody likes that or not is another matter, but we are able to see ourselves as one human people. And that's possible for us, of course, as Baha'is, because of the covenant that Baha'u'llah has established through Abdu'l-Baha with his followers. But that very fact underlines the point that this is God's work. This is not because of our perfection, because we Baha'is are somehow superior, or the Jews were superior, or the Christians, or the Muslims, or any other special group of people. Baha'u'llah says, O people of Baha, that there are none to rival you is a sign of mercy. It's a sign of mercy, not of your own deserving or something. But the perennial challenge of evolution continues. The perennial challenge of evolution is to be constantly open to change, to process, to development, and so on. But now it faces intensely the individual, not merely the society as a whole, as in the past. And it does so within the process of the evolution of the cause of Baha'u'llah. And we took a look at the stages through which that cause has evolved. And we recognize that this is eternal. This is the eternal faith of God. What's the changeless faith of God? Eternal in the past, eternal in the future, moving from one stage to another until we become used to it, until we at last accept the fact that learning is, to learn is to be human. To learn is a process that never ends in this world and obviously not in the next world either. Now, most believers have opened themselves to the divine plan. We all recognize that the divine plan is created ultimately by Abdu'l-Baha, that it's directed by the head of the faith, first the guardian, now the Universal House of Justice. So we know it's the plan that we should be proceeding with, that we should be pursuing, and we are open to its requirements. They're demanding at every stage, but nevertheless, the Baha'i community has successfully met each one of these challenges, and it will go on doing so. But there have been a few Baha'is, and mercifully very, very few Baha'is, who have found it very difficult to do that. Almost, I won't say impossible, because nothing is impossible, obviously, with God, but many people have, who to some extent or other have been slow to respond, have included a few people who simply weren't able ultimately to get their minds around it at all, or to associate their heart with it, or whatever the process was. And in doing so, they've missed the great opportunity of human life. And I hope that this series of sessions that we've had here will help us to focus a little more sharply on this challenge, because we're now at the opening of another new stage, a very challenging new stage, a series of plans that are going to take the Baha'i community through to the year 2021, which will be the centenary of the conclusion of the heroic age and the opening of the formative age in which the kingdom of God is going to be constructed. The Baha'i community, we have to stop and think, the Baha'i community 10 or 20 years from now is not going to resemble anything we today can imagine. And the things that will surprise surprise us very much will be commonplace features of the cause of God in the future. What the cause calls on us today to do is to grow up, because the childhood of our community is passing away. God's been very patient, very tolerant, very generous with mankind as a whole, and equally certainly so with Baha'is. But humanity needs Baha'is to become spiritually mature. That's the stage that society has arrived at today, and that will entail us as Baha'is becoming steadily drawn into ever more deep engagement with the challenges that civil society around us is facing. So, not surprisingly, therefore, the present plan focuses on learning, and learning requires discipline. The plan is obviously systematizing our work. That's a little bit difficult for some people. The plan it emphasizes the inner growth of the individual, not merely external activities, which we're quite good at, especially here in the West. It's a plan that emphasizes the inclusive nature of the faith, that Baha'i has come for everybody, not just for us, and that therefore the very nature of Baha'i activities, the core activities particularly, the veil between us and them gets thinner and thinner and thinner as more and more people become engaged with the teachings themselves and facing the challenge. It requires us to be willing to escape our comfort zones. As comfort zones are one of the biggest challenges that people face in life. And really, if you look over past history, as we've done here, the human race hasn't done terribly well with freeing itself from comfort zones in the past. We can't repeat that history because we're living in a whole different stage in the development of humankind. We Baha'is are at a kind of boot camp, you might say. We're being trained like adults, not as the children or even early adolescents we were in the past. We are not a congregation. We are, in the words of the Guardian, the nucleus of a world commonwealth. And the excitement for the work of the faith in the future would be impossible to really sum up in any words today. Abdu'l-Baha does it, as always, best of all, when he says to the Baha'i community, he says, you Baha'i community, you must be, I think we mentioned this in an earlier point in the series, he says, you must become the very soul of the world. You must become God's mercy to mankind. You must become God's grace. And he says, rise up with such qualities and capacities as to become the soul of the world, and thus to lead this young child, humanity, to the stage of its adulthood.